It can be as young as 7 for girls in developed countries, which isn't typical, but is possible. Or it may occur as late as 13, which again is not typical, but it's possible. Someone may seem to go through the entire process of puberty as quickly as 1.5 years, while somebody may take more than 4 years. So the process of puberty is not something that can be quantified regarding age. It just can't, because there's so many factors affecting when the process begins as well as how it proceeds. So although we tend to focus on menarche as the pivotal sign of puberty for girls, there are others as well. For girls, it usually begins with the growth of soft pubic hair, followed by breasts beginning to develop, a growth spurt, growth of reproductive organs, the beginning of menstruation, her skin changes. For boys, it usually proceeds with the growth of testes and pubic hair, a growth spurt, their penis grows, their voice deepens, spermarche, underarm hair changes in their skin. But bringing culture into this, the vast majority of these conclusions are based on white boys and girls in developed countries. And as I will discuss later on, where a person lives in the world can have a really significant effect on how they develop physically, including the start and progression of puberty. Now, you might think this is all there is to say regarding physical changes that occur at this time and regarding how these changes affect boys compared to girls. But there are more differences in physical development than you probably would ever be aware of. For example, it is not just a stereotype that during puberty, a boy will usually increase in strength and athletic performance more than a girl. It's a stereotype, but it has some truth to it. This is related both directly and indirectly to culture and expectations of somebody, whether they're male or female. So throughout the course, cultural difference, cultural variation is a main theme, and in regard to puberty, in particular, cultural variations. And when it comes to physical activity, gender is huge. Especially in traditional cultures that are collectivistic in nature, boys will be expected to conform to the stereotype of being very physically active, which means, conversely, girls will be expected to conform to a feminine stereotype that does not include being really physically active. So as I've said, everyone goes through puberty. It's a universal human physical experience, but culturally speaking, there are differences. In terms of when a person is likely to start puberty, there are several factors that can potentially affect that. Factors you might not necessarily think of. We all have a general length of time when puberty will start. At some point in that length of time, it's going to happen. The academic term for this is reaction range, which means that genetically, your body is kind of preset to start puberty within a certain time range. But your environment is going to affect when that occurs within that range. For example, diet and nutrition is huge. And this is going to be affected by a few things. Your country's basic ability to produce food. Food production will have an effect. Access to adequate and healthy nutrition is going to be affected by your socioeconomic status. And your culture will determine what you eat. So your overall health will affect when you start puberty, and this includes things like the ability to practice good hygiene, access to clean drinking water, access to regular and reliable medical care, maybe even other environmental factors like pollution or genetic factors. All of these are going to influence the timing of puberty. And all of these factors are not just important when puberty is expected to start, but it's their health and birth leading up to the start of puberty. So in those cultures where good nutrition and medical care are widely available, such as ours, puberty tends to begin earlier. Historical records consistently indicate a steady decrease in the average age of menarche in Western countries over the last 150 years. The age at which girls tend to have their period for the first time has decreased over the years. So not just in Canada and the US, in all modernized societies. So this is known as a secular trend, which is just a fancy way of saying that there's a change in the characteristics of an entire population over time. Now, is this absolutely exact? No, because menarche is not the only indicator of the initiation of puberty. Remember, the first inward signs of puberty are earlier than that, and of course for boys this does not occur. But for the most part, menarche is a pretty good indicator of when these other parts of puberty begin. And although we don't have an exactly comparable event for boys, it seems pretty reasonable to assume that their puberty has been progressing at the same way, meaning that age at puberty has declined. Now, it might sound funny to say it, and I really don't mean it as a joke, but we don't have records of when boys first began to experience ejaculation 100 years ago, or when they start now. I mean, think about it. When a girl begins menstruating, she needs supplies to deal with that. She has to speak to somebody, usually her mom or her sister or another relative. But in all seriousness, a boy does not have to talk to somebody about when he ejaculates for the first time. So, why has puberty started to occur earlier in various countries? Because of what I've already said. Improvements in nutrition, including more reliable mass food production. Food production and safety have increased nutrition. And remember that the beginning of puberty is linked to fat in the body. So girls who have little body fat due to lack of nutrition or malnutrition, even today, they tend to start their period at a later age. So increased food production and more reliable food production has had an effect on when puberty begins. Improvements in regular and consistent and more advanced medical care has had an influence. Medical advancements like vaccines that have reduced illness, better, more effective methods of dealing with germs and bacteria, they've resulted in a healthier population overall. Because people are healthier, they weigh more and they have the opportunity to put on weight. In addition, we have further evidence that these advancements have had an effect. If you compare countries right now in the present who are not developed with Western countries, this provides more evidence supporting the idea that improved nutrition and medical care have caused a decrease in the typical age at onset of puberty. So if you look at this globally speaking right now, the average age at menarche is lowest in developed countries like ours, where these things are not an issue. We have abundant food, medical care is relatively easily and readily available, but it's much higher in developing countries where there may be limited medical care, poor nutrition, or both. We can even bring in race and ethnicity with this discussion and compare people of the same ethnicity living in different countries. So African American girls living in the United States compared to African girls living in Africa. In Africa, depending on exactly what country you're looking at, the average age at menarche can vary, but none of them have an average as low as that of the US. In fact, in some African countries, the average age of menarche is 15, 16, or even 17. But for African American girls, it's 12.2. We can also bring into the discussion the effect of socioeconomic status, because studies indicate that adolescent girls from more affluent families tend to menstruate earlier than girls from poorer families, because economic differences affect nutrition, healthcare, and all of that. So overall then, what we can say is the healthier the environment, the lower the timing of menarche, and thus puberty overall. But keep in mind, even in an unhealthy environment, it will eventually happen. It may happen later, but it's going to happen. And even in a really healthy environment, it may be delayed. For example, it has long been recognized that girls who are involved in activities where it's necessary to keep their weight very low will experience menarche later and then often have inconsistent periods once they do. So girls in ballet, competitive gymnastics, competitive swimmers, that kind of thing. It's almost like, even though they're really, really healthy, that their body responds to their low weight and lack of fat as malnutrition. And since levels of fat are what is needed to get the whole process started, if it isn't there, it's going to be delayed. So, research indicates that age at menarche is stable now in developed countries. The decline has leveled off. So the decline isn't going to continue. We're not going to one day have kids in grade 1 or 2 getting their periods. It's leveled off. And menstruation is not the only change, as we know, that occurs during puberty for girls, although it tends to be the one we focus on the most. If we look at breast development, according to one study in the US, breast development can begin by age 7 for about 10% of white girls. Now keep in mind, this would be breast buds. 15% of girls who are Latina in origin, and 23% of African American girls. And as I've already said, this race and ethnicity clearly has an effect. Yes, so I think that's all we need to say about that. So I get ahead of myself. If we were in class, you would just shake your head at me and smile because I tend to do that. Okay, so let's continue then and look at how going through puberty is viewed around the world. So this is really focused on culture, and I personally find this really interesting. Because I always try to superimpose myself. If I grew up somewhere else, what would my life have been like? In other parts of the world, other than North America and Western societies, menarche is somewhat public, or should I say not completely private. So that this event, the first time a girl gets her period, is often marked by some kind of ritual. Now, we generally don't have those here in Canada, do we? Here, maybe a mom or a sister or an aunt or somebody will perceive them a bit differently, might treat them a bit differently. Oh, our little girl is growing up. But there's really nothing culturally speaking that we would consider a ritual. A girl will be told this is what you need to do, maybe have a little talk with her about hygiene, explain the different kinds of pads, the overnight ones with wings compared to daily panty liners, thin ones compared to thicker ones, advantages and disadvantages of pads versus tampons, that kind of thing. But we don't have rituals. It is remarkably common for some cultures, however, to have really strong beliefs concerning the power of menstrual blood. In cultures that are more traditional in nature, for example, it might be believed to present a danger to the growth and life of crops, to the health of livestock, to the success of hunters, to the health and well-being of other people, particularly the menstruating woman's husband. Because of this, the behavior and movement of a woman when she's menstruating are often restricted. This could be in relation to preparing food so that they won't be allowed to contaminate the food in some way if they prepare it when they have their period. They might not be allowed to consume food, to eat with everybody else, so they don't have meals with their family. They might be restricted in terms of access to social activities, so they can't attend anything or go anywhere else where there's other people. They might be restricted in some way regarding their religious practices, so they can't attend any kind of ceremony or worship or enter a building. Sometimes they have to follow certain bathing rituals. So they have to have a bath in a special manner when their period is over. Maybe girls cannot attend school when they have their period. And they may not be allowed to participate in any kind of sexual activities at all if they're married and they have their period. All of this suggests a view of menstruating and menstrual blood as negative, something to be avoided, something to almost be condemned. But not all cultural traditions align with that perspective, because some cultures view menstrual blood as having positive powers. And it's sometimes believed to promote fertility and thus is used in fertility rituals. Some cultures use it in the treatment of certain medical conditions or as an ingredient in a love potion. So let's look at a couple specific cultures. The Asante is a culture in the African nation of Ghana, which is towards the top left of the map here. It's a matrilineal society, so that line of descent is traced through the mother. And in this culture, menstruating women are subject to very, very stringent regulations concerning where they're allowed to go and what they're allowed to do. Violating any of these is taken very seriously and may even result in death. But when a girl first gets her period, a girl's menarche is a time of celebration that is very, very elaborate. The girls will sit under a canopy in front of people, which is a symbol of honor that's usually reserved for royalty, and everybody comes to congratulate her, to give her presents, and they perform songs and dances in her honor. Immediately after this puberty ritual, historically, a girl would be given a golden ring called a patia, if I'm pronouncing that correctly, which means I love you. In the Asante culture, even marriage is not an event considered worthy of ritual in the way a girl's menarche is. A marriage is simply something that normally occurs soon after puberty when a girl becomes a woman. But the event of a girl becoming a woman is celebrated. It's honored. She is honored, but only the first time. After that, the rest of the time, every month is treated almost fearfully. Traditional practices of Orthodox Jews are similar in a way, and by that I mean in that they're also kind of ambivalent. Traditionally, when girls would tell their mothers they had started their period for the first time, their mother would sometimes slap them on the face, which was supposed to signify the future difficulties awaiting her as a woman. Furthermore, every time they menstruated, an Orthodox Jewish woman would have a ritual bath called a mikvah a week after the period finished. And the purpose of this was to cleanse them of the impurities believed to be associated with menstruation. Now, there are several biblical regulations that require full immersion over the head to regain ritual purity after ritually impure events have occurred, such as menstruation. So again, a distinctly negative connotation to it. Orthodox women were also prohibited from engaging in sexual intercourse during menstruation. Now, these days, there's no ritualistic slap. An Orthodox Jewish woman will still refrain from sexual activity with her husband during menstruation, and the mikvah still exists. But it's no longer done to really signify getting rid of something negative. Instead, it's considered more of a way to connect with other Jewish women, and it's considered a connection to Jewish women, historically speaking, kind of a way to keep in touch with the past. So these two pictures are showing what a mikvah looks like these days. Another continued purpose of the mikvah bath is that it is not until it is complete, a week after she has finished menstruating, that a woman can resume sexual relations with her husband. So it also has the added connotation of enabling sexual activity. A mikvah also must occur after childbirth, but if you're not aware of this, after childbirth, a woman typically has her period for around a month straight, so that makes sense. But the existence of a mikvah is considered so important for Orthodox Jews that a community is required to construct a mikvah even before they construct a synagogue. So overall then, we can see that puberty rituals for girls tend to focus on one singular biological event, the beginning of menstruation, likely because it's a clearly identifiable event. And although puberty rituals for boys tend not to be so elaborate, male rituals do share some common characteristics in that the focus of these are similar. Typically, puberty rituals for boys require them in some way to demonstrate courage, strength, and endurance. Especially in traditional cultures, these are characteristics that would be required of them much more than in Western cultures. Demonstrating skills or characteristics in relation to hunting, fishing, physically providing for their families, that kind of thing. So the puberty rituals for boys are considered symbolic of indicating what will be required of them as an adult male in that culture. And sometimes they're considered a way of testing whether they would be able to live up to the challenges of being a man. In some cultures, Puberty rituals for males are what we would consider quite violent, requiring them to submit to bloodletting of some kind. In New Guinea, the Sambia require a boy to climb onto the back of a sponsor who will run through a group of older men who bat the boy on his back until it's bloody. In Ethiopia, boys are forced to take part in whipping contests. Historically, in New Mexico, the Pueblo Indians would take boys at some point between the age of 12 and 15 away from home and perform purification ceremonies. In many African and Asian cultures, boys historically would be publicly circumcised when they reached puberty. In Judaism, boys are bar mitzvahed, which literally means son of the commandment, on their 13th birthday. And what this does is mark the moment when the child is responsible for observing the commandments and all Jewish teachings. Of course, because of where we live and how we've been socialized, our norms and culture are very different. So some of this sounds very odd to us. But in the places where rituals occur, they are considered necessary for a boy to successfully pass from adolescence into manhood and to be ready for the challenges they'll face as an adult. Samoa is in the Pacific Ocean near New Zealand. That's why I've got the map here for you to see. And for both males and females in Samoa, tattooing is a traditional rite of passage for them, because this is a culture where tattooing upholds a lot of significance and meaning. It has meaning in terms of religion and warfare. And traditionally, historically, tattooing was used to mark the beginning of adolescence somewhere between the ages of 14 to 16. So clearly, I don't mean tattooing the way our culture views it. These would be extremely, extremely elaborate tattoos completed in a traditional manner, not with a tattoo gun. Girls would take anywhere from 5 to 6 days to complete, and for boys it would be 2 to 4 months. So when these tattooing sessions would occur, it would typically start in the morning and go until dusk, or until the male could no longer stand the pain. And then they would resume the following day. The only time they wouldn't would be as if the skin was so inflamed that it needed a few days to heal. And this pain would usually be quite intense because, again, it would be using a traditional tattooing tool, as you see here, not a tattoo gun. There would be a lot of risk of infection. That would be a concern. Because of these traditional tools, the artist would use a mallet to tap the teeth of the comb with ink on it into the person's flesh, following very, very simple marks as guidelines. And they would be really elaborate geometric patterns extending all the way from the waist to the knees. Now, if somebody was to shy away from being tattooed, they would be at a very real risk of being labeled a coward, and they would be insulted by the rest of their tribe. So being tattooed was also considered essential to sexual attractiveness and to being accepted as a legitimate candidate for full adult status. If a boy just couldn't take the pain and quit before their tattoo was complete, they would, in a very real sense, wear that as a mark of shame their entire life. When the tattoo was done, the boy's family would help them to celebrate. They would throw a party for them. They would smash a water vessel at his feet. But having it done was considered a symbol of their dedication to their cultural traditions. And as I said, this process usually took months. So the tattooed skin would have to be washed in salt water to prevent infection. And the body, part of the body where the tattoo was, would be massaged. And family and friends would have to help in the healing process because it was so painful. Simple things like walking, sitting, could irritate the inflamed skin and cause great pain. And then within 6 months, these distinctive designs would appear on their skin, and it might take up to a year to completely heal. Now, the anthropologist Margaret Mead visited Samoa, and wrote a book called Coming of Age in Samoa, which was published in 1928, which brought a lot of attention to this practice. But in the last 100 years, because of globalization, this practice has been severely affected. When missionaries arrived there, they specifically tried to stamp it out. They viewed it as too savage. And young people have been affected by globalization, as I alluded to in the first chapter. And all of this really acted to undermine this traditional practice of tattooing. At this point, most Samoans have abandoned it the way it used to be done, but it has continued in a modified way, so to speak, and that's what these pictures demonstrate. Now, what about Western culture?